I'm Dr. Roger Mustalish, Adjunct Professor of Environmental Health at Creighton University and President of the ASEER Foundation. ASEER is the Amazon Center for Environmental Education and Research, a nonprofit working to conserve the Amazon rainforest in Peru. Happy today to be here to celebrate National Public Health Week and to speak about climate change. My backdrop for today is the McNichol Art Gallery at Newman University outside of Philadelphia. And we're here with an exhibit about the Essayaha people of the Amazon. The Essayaha are a hunter-gatherer society on the brink of cultural extinction. As someone who works in conservation, typically we work to conserve plants and animals. We often don't think, though, that there are cultures, indigenous cultures, around the world and in the Amazon that are going extinct. We have a lot to learn from indigenous cultures, and I think particularly with climate change, there is a message that they have for us. Climate change is being referred to as perhaps the most significant public health challenge of our lifetimes. And it's going to be incumbent upon all of us to better understand what's going on and how we as public health professionals can respond. To help me in my conversation with you today is Dr. Paul Morgan, who's joining us from his home in Pennsylvania. Paul is a professor at Westchester University, but he's also chair of the board of the ASEER Foundation. So, to start this conversation, I would direct you to the Centers for Disease Control website that has an excellent presentation on climate change and human health effects. So let me just quickly step you through the image that you're currently seeing. The climate change cycle begins with increasing carbon dioxide levels, as you see in the center of the diagram. This results in rising temperatures that also increases moisture content in the atmosphere. Those two things feed into more extreme weather conditions. These weather conditions can be the superstorms that hit Puerto Rico and the Carolinas just recently. It could be attributed in part to the severe flooding that our neighbors in Nebraska are seeing with the Missouri River and the Platte River. And it also can be attributed to problems that we're seeing with drought and a year-long fire season in places like the Pacific Northwest. This combination of moisture and high temperatures is also melting glaciers and the polar ice caps, resulting in increased sea level rise. And this cycle will continue and continue and continue and get worse and worse unless something is done. To start to see what the spin-offs are, take a look at the second tier on this particular diagram. Starting with environmental degradation, you're going to start to see forced migration, civil conflict, and even mental health impacts from the stress. There are already refugees from climate change here in the United States. A Native American community in Louisiana has to move because their community is sinking and being swamped by flooding, storm surges, and increased storm activity. In Alaska, there are native peoples who have to change the way that they live because there's no longer year-long sea ice that impacts their hunting, their fishing, and their livelihoods. Extreme heat is going to be increasingly more common in places like Mumbai or in the Saudi Peninsula, for example. Heat-related illness and death, cardiovascular failure, all occurs when people reach their thermal capacity. The severe weather that I referenced before is going to result in loss of infrastructure, increased injuries, fatalities, and the stress associated with that. Just take a look at what happened with winter tornadoes hitting the Gulf states and the widespread damage that was causing. Or think about how drought led to the California fires that destroyed the town of Paradise. Air pollution will continue to worsen, and so we're going to see, and in fact we're witnessing already, increased incidence and increased severity in things like cardiovascular disease and asthma. And one of the things that we see down in Peru is that as climate change kicks in, there's changes in vector ecology. So whether it's malaria, whether it's dengue, whether it's yellow fever, whether it is leishmaniasis, we're starting to see increased rates of that. Our Essayaha friends tell us that they're already starting to see changes in the rainforest itself. And in Pennsylvania, that's got an endemic level of Lyme disease, normally there would be a spate, a bit of reprieve over the winter when snow and really cold weather would suppress the tick populations. But you could go out in January and see ticks still alive, still moving around, and still posing a threat to public health. And finally, in many parts of the United States and around the world, with this increasing moisture in the environment, increasing rainfall, you're going to start to see increased pollen, increased allergens being produced, molds. This is going to continue to worsen respiratory allergies as well as asthma. So it's a daunting challenge that is facing us as a public health community and as a society.
Now let's take a look at how climate change will impact water quality. Not too many years ago, due to changing rainforest patterns in the central Amazon jungle of Peru, a number of villages along the Rio Pisqui watershed were completely wiped out by floodwaters. People lost their houses, they lost their agricultural crops, they lost everything. People were killed in the flooding, and one of the very first waterborne diseases to follow was cholera. It's taken that village and those villagers many, many years to recover from that single event. We saw last year, for example, in Florida on both coasts, a problem with red tide, impacting not only marine animals like manatees and fish, but also impacting property values and disrupting the tourist trade. So you can expect these kinds of impacts to be felt worldwide as climate change alters coastlines and impacts life even further inland. Finally, in looking at water and food supply impacts, what you're going to see is a cascading effect. Along coastal areas, you may find safe drinking water and food production areas completely eliminated due to permanent or seasonal flooding. You may find some areas, for example, that are marginal in terms of available water supply or the ability to produce food suddenly because of either flooding or drought, unable to produce the food supplies that are counted on by the local people. This is going to result in areas of significant food scarcity. But even in areas like the U.S. Midwest that are abundant food production areas, we're already starting to see the impacts of excessive flooding and snow melt impacting the farmers' ability to get their crops in the spring. We also are seeing how severe weather like tornadoes can destroy crops in localized areas. And finally, with warming temperatures, some of the crops that we count on and that we grow in lower latitudes are not going to survive the heat. And so you'll see the migration of food growing areas to perhaps colder, cooler latitudes, disrupting not only the food supply in those regions, but the ability of farmers to survive economically. When you take all of these factors into consideration, I think that you can appreciate why some do feel that climate change will be the most challenging public health issue of our lifetime.
Let's start with our guest, Paul. Paul, thank you for joining us on this conversation. And the first question is, what can you share with us based on your experience about the warming climate that we're all experiencing?
So for a status report on climate change, the best place to look probably is the UN FCC's report, which came out last fall, called Global Warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade. Technical report, not something that everybody reads, but it was really significant because it kind of laid out in kind of alarming detail what's going to happen if we don't limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The target over the recent years has really been 2 degrees, but for a lot of island nations in particular, that was considered already too much because it meant they were going to be sacrificed in essence. But the IPCC report that came out last fall basically said we have maybe 10 years to get things under control. Otherwise, we're going to see basically runaway climate change, which means we're going to sort of slip into those tipping points that we didn't want to slip into. And that means sort of catastrophe for everybody. And so this was a significant wake-up call. And if you don't want to read the entire report, there are some sort of executive summaries that lay it out in enough detail for just the layperson. The next report that came out not too long after that was the U.S. version, basically, of the IPCC report, which is the fourth National Climate Assessment. And it was sort of interesting that it came out anyway because it came from an administration that isn't particularly interested in dealing with climate change, but they're required by law to issue this report. And in the report, it basically said, again, what we are seeing now is climate change effects in the present. It's not something that's going to happen in the distant future. It's not something about our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. We're seeing the impacts of climate change now. It's in the U.S. It's evidenced in things like wildfires, storms of increased intensity. These are the kinds of things that are really concerning. In addition to that, you're also seeing, evidence in more, I wouldn't say popular literature, but not just technical reports. There's a great book by David Wallace Wells that came out just in February titled The Uninhabitable Earth. And what he did in that book was basically take a look at all the research that's been done. He did this over a couple of years and be able to kind of translate that into language that the regular person can understand. And it's really, really, really scary because what we don't want to believe looks like could be reality before we know it, which means we don't have a lot of time. So unfortunately, the status of climate change now is critical. And it's really hard to kind of break through the bubble of distraction and so many other concerns to really see that. But that is the status of things right now.
Paul, I hear, I'm sure you hear as well, that with the winter that we are just coming out of, with the polar vortex sending temperatures plummeting in the upper Midwest, and even on the East Coast, where low temperatures were 20, 30, even 40 degrees below normal, people say, how could there be climate change? What's your response to that?
Yeah, so when people experience something like the polar vortex and think, wow, obviously climate change isn't real because we are experiencing these record lows, we're kind of misunderstanding the nature of global warming. And part of this is a problem of language. While it is popularly called global warming, it's really climate change. Some have used more interesting expressions like global weirding or climate disruption. It means lots of things are going to be going haywire. It is true that the average global temperature is increasing. It has been increasing for some time, and it will continue to increase. But the effects of that aren't simply going to be no winter. It means there will be winter. We will have fewer glaciers. There may be less snow, but the entire sort of climate system that we've depended on for hundreds of thousands of years really is being disrupted. New patterns are emerging, and we're really not prepared to handle that. We can adapt. Humans are very adaptable, but the reality is that what we predict based on the global warming is happening. And that means, yes, sometimes it's going to be crazy winters. You're going to have polar vortexes, but that doesn't say anything about the reality of the situation. Really, it just confirms it. But we need to understand the science a little better to do that. And so a little more scientific literacy would help, of course.
Well, Paul, then, if climate change is real, and if it's happening now, then why are there so many skeptics, even at the highest levels of our own government, denying that it's happening? You and I stood in the village of Urubamba in the Andes in Peru and heard the villagers explain how climate change is melting their glaciers at such a rate that massive mudslides and ice chunks and boulders have been coming down and destroying their village. And I have a student at Creighton who lives in Micronesia, and he's just posted some pictures about a major super cyclone that destroyed most of his island, and a nuclear waste site that stores waste from atomic bomb testing in the Pacific in the 1950s and 60s that is in jeopardy of being breached by rising sea levels. So with this clear evidence all around us, why are there so many skeptics?
There are skeptics at the highest levels. Why is it that a lot of very smart, rational, in some cases, people don't so-called believe in climate change? Well, part of the language is it's really not belief. Climate change isn't a religious question. It's a question of accepting evidence. The evidence is overwhelming. That is just a fact that 97% of kind of scientific studies say, yes, it's caused by humans. It is happening, and we need to do something about it, basically. And while there will be continued doubts about any particular element of the research, when we have 7% of a scientific community saying this is good, that's as good as it's going to get. And so we need to act on that. We don't bet on the long shot. But why people don't accept or believe, there's been really interesting research done on this, because a lot of it goes down to not this idea that people are somehow not drawing the right conclusions from the evidence. The reality is that people operate not as sort of machines. Our values lead us. Our stories lead us. And some of the great work done on this, for instance, by Dan Kahan, suggests that sometimes the most important thing is remaining kind of a member of a group. And we will do whatever we need to do to remain part of a group. Historically, of course, one of the worst things that could happen to a person was to be banished from a community because you couldn't survive on your own. And so our survival strategies get us to do things that are maybe on the face irrational, but are rational because it helps us maintain status in a group. And right now we have a kind of a political party and a way of thinking in the United States that says, well, yeah, if you want to be with your people, this is one of the kind of lines you have to accept, that climate change isn't real, or the evidence isn't in, or things like that. But it's not based on a real sophisticated analysis of the evidence where people draw conclusions. It's what do we believe to remain part of the group? And so fighting against that is difficult, but that means we need to be very savvy about how you pitch these kinds of things. How can people remain in their group and still kind of accept the evidence? And that's a psychological question, a sociological question. Ramming the evidence down people's throats doesn't work. We need to be a little more sophisticated about that, but that's sort of what's going on.
Paul, you were our representative, the ASEER's representative at the Paris Climate Treaty talks. Could you share some of your experiences and tell us a little bit about how that meeting took place?
I was at the Paris climate talks in December of 2015. Certainly a unique and interesting experience. It was melancholy to start because just 3 weeks before, there were the attacks in Paris, which were unrelated to the climate talks, but you may recall it was in the Bataclan, the music venue where people were slaughtered. We were scheduled to go. There was some question about whether the talks would continue, but they did go, fortunately, because it was really a signal event in the history of civilization in many ways. It was the largest gathering of heads of state under one roof ever in history. I think there were 150 heads of state in attendance at one time. Obviously a security question, especially given what had happened just a few weeks before. But there was that sense that we must do this. So there was a tremendous sense of optimism because you had so many heads of state putting their bodies on the line, basically saying, yes, this is real. We're serious about doing something about it. And so from my sense, there was no doubt that there was going to be some kind of agreement after this. The question was how robust of an agreement was it going to be? For some perspectives, it was good to see. But when you get inside the talks, you get to hear perspectives from non-highly developed countries who were worried about things like loss and damage. When you have places in the Philippines being wiped out by typhoons, and the typhoons have been made stronger by the industrial activities of Europe and North America, who pays for the damage? There's lots of countries that have contributed almost nothing to climate change, and yet will be receiving the worst of its effects and will be the least able to recover. And so the big questions that remain still are, who's responsible for paying the damage when places who have contributed nothing get injured? It's going to be bad enough when we have, serious effects all over the United States, but even wildfires in California, rising sea levels in Florida, that's going to be challenging enough. But what about countries, that are asking us, well, how are you going to take care of us? So those are some of the big questions. And in addition, while I was there, you got a sense that, this was going to be an agreement, but it was going to be really kicking the can down the road. There's still a lot of hard decisions to make. If we continued kind of as business as usual, even if we implement the agreement as is, it's still not enough to get us to 2 degrees centigrade or ideally to 1.5. And so there was no commitment to 1.5, but it was there. So while I was there, I got to see a lot of sort of presentations, press conferences from people you don't typically hear from, and to get their perspective. And it was certainly eye-opening, because you begin to see, well, there's much a bigger world out there that has a different take on climate change, and they're not too happy, frankly, with the industrialized world and kind of our fairly lax response to the challenges. So fantastic. These subsequent COPs, climate meetings, have done some to kind of put in place processes for making sure that we can account for the changes, et cetera. But it was a good start. But the ambition needs to be ratcheted up.
Well, Paul, now that the U.S. has pulled out of that agreement, what do you think it means for global efforts to combat climate change?
Well, yeah, the U.S. administration, we'll just call it that, has stated its intention to pull the United States out of the Paris Agreement. That's not something that can be done simply by waving a wand. It is a process, and it can't actually happen until November 4th, 2020, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the day after the next U.S. presidential election. And so while the intention is there to pull out of the agreement, nobody has actually pulled us out yet. So that it takes time. Built into the UNFCCC process is this process for kind of pulling out, and it's not instantaneous. So the good news, I suppose, is while the U.S. commitment is flagging, there's still an opportunity to kind of prevent us from pulling out. And I certainly think that we should be in, because there's really no other country on the planet that has pulled out. Everybody's in except the United States, and I think North Korea. Not great company. So I think we can be optimistic that I think something will happen. There are also folks who say there's movements like We're Still In, which is made up of governors and corporate executives and mayors who saying, well, if the federal government isn't going to do it, we'll take care of business as best we can. So at least the citizens of the United States can say, while our representatives and government may not be into this, we'll do what we can to make sure it happens. So I'm optimistic there.
Paul, we both worked in the Amazon for a number of years now, and it's the world's largest intact tropical rainforest. It takes billions of tons of carbon dioxide every year out of the atmosphere. When you speak to groups and when you reflect on the need for climate change mitigation efforts, what role do you see for rainforests like the Amazon?
As for the Amazon and climate change, obviously, I think people understand that we need to keep forests standing. They're tremendous lungs of the planet, obviously. They hold tremendous amounts of carbon. If you cut those things down, we begin to mess with the planetary system in ways that can't be reversed. While it's okay to do some reforestation, and I think restoration work is really important, it is far easier to keep trees standing and to keep ecosystems standing, because it's not just trees. The rainforest is not simply a lot of trees. It's complex systems that are doing so much beyond what we can really even understand. And so we don't want to be messing with that, clearly, particularly for short-term economic gain. I think it's particularly important from an indigenous perspective, because a lot of the research says if you want to really maintain forests well, make sure indigenous peoples have access to that and use them as they've done for hundreds of thousands of years, if not longer. It's a sustainable practice. While we may not all want to live like the indigenous peoples of the world, we should be able to put ourselves in a position where we're learning from and listening to them so that we can sort of create a possible path for the future. Right now, understanding of how standing forests contribute to climate stability, it's pretty good. Our understanding is there. So we just need to make sure that we have policies and practices and consumer behaviors that sort of can contribute to that. So it's really important that everybody understands that. We are connected to the Amazon, and the Amazon is connected to that's what's in our lungs too. So I think it's absolutely essential we have organizations that have that global reach so that people can see their role in the whole planet. So yeah.
Paul, a final question. I get this asked all the time. I'm curious what your response is. When you look at the dire consequences of climate change, the potential health impacts, the changes in ecology and displacement and creation of refugees and conflict and stresses, are you optimistic or are you pessimistic about our ability as a global society to challenge this issue? And where do you think we go from here?
Well, in terms of my view about being optimistic or pessimistic, the evidence these days is grim. There's no doubt about it. If you're paying attention to this stuff, and I try to, it's hard not to come away from it and say, wow, the alarm bells are ringing, and very few people are hearing them. And we can't instantaneously sort of redirect civilization when we finally get it. My own view, at least this week, is it may take some series of events or catastrophic events, which have already happened to a certain extent, before we really begin to do something. And by then, of course, it's going to be too late for some people, for some species, for some ecosystems, because it'll be too far gone. We've already kind of got warming built in, and it's not going to be easy to take carbon and carbon equivalents out of the atmosphere. That technology is not well developed. We get closer and closer to having to do things that are extreme, geoengineering. So my concern is that people are not hearing it. But I'm also optimistic in that I see young people. I know Greta Thunberg, who was at the most recent COP in Poland, a 15-year-old from Sweden, who gave a 3-minute talk basically calling everybody out and saying, if you don't do what needs to be done to make sure that people of my generation have a livable future, well, get out of the way and we'll do it. So ultimately, she said, people have the power. And I'm very optimistic that once people sort of get the sense that this is going to be essential and something to do, we will begin to really transform. How that transformation happens, actually, that's the stuff that I'm most interested in, because we need to do more than just sort of incremental change. And it could be very exciting. Some have sort of likened this to the transition from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. We need to undergo a worldview transition, and we need to do it rapidly. But those kinds of transitions are unprecedented. So this is an unprecedented situation. Scientists tell us what's going to happen if we continue on the same tracks. And yet we are so committed to those same tracks, it's a kind of an addiction. And so there are forces at work from our kind of addiction to growth, our economic system, and our ideologies of progress, our visions of what we think the future ought to be, so ingrained in our cultural narrative that it will take something extra special. And the educational system, the work of organizations like ASEER working on the ground, it's going to take everybody doing something. So as long as we continue to work, we can maintain hope. That's the best thing we could do.
Paul, thanks a lot. I appreciate your insight and taking the time to share your perspective with us. Many of you may be wondering what you can do, even right now. I direct you to a website, Climate 911. In particular, take a look at It's Time to Act Locally. You'll see a small number of videos about what communities around the country are already starting to do, whether it's around renewable energy, whether it's around other conservation efforts, in order to start to take some grassroots steps towards conservation. Second thing you might be interested is this website done by Fitz Labs. It gives you an opportunity to put in your own local city or zip code, and based on an interactive map and projections of how climate change is going to impact the United States over the next decades, you can find out what your climate is going to look like in the future. So for example, when I did it for the Philadelphia area, I found that in the coming decades, Philadelphia's temperature is going to be about 9 degrees warmer and about 41% rainier. So each of you can go to this website and then find out what you may be facing as a local community. Let me conclude with one little story, since we're here in this beautiful exhibit about the SEAH. The SEAH tell us about a great forest spirit that dwells in the rainforest with them. They call this spirit Idosikana. Idosikana is neither a good spirit or a bad spirit. It depends on how the SEAH behave. If the SEAH take just what they need from the rainforest, if they share, if they protect the forests so that future generations of Ese'eha can thrive, then Adosi-Kana is happy, and the Ese'eha are rewarded with food and water and shelter and medicine. But if the Ese'eha get greedy, if they take more than they need, if they waste, and if they destroy the forests so that future generations of Ese'eha cannot survive, then Adosi-Kana gets angry and punishes them. The Ese'eha have no idea what our lifestyle is like. They would be bewildered by our contemporary society. So the Ese'eha want to know what our Great Spirit, what our Adosi-Kana would say about the way that we're using our planet. Are we taking just what we need? Are we protecting it? Are we assuring that future generations can thrive? Or are we greedy? Are we damaging the system such that we're going to have serious, serious consequences? I'm going to let you reflect on that. I want to thank you for joining me and Paul in this conversation about climate change, and I want to thank Creighton University for the opportunity to speak with you.